Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Tracy Glenn, and I'm one of the organizers of tonight's Tertulia with Harsha Walia on her new book, Border and Rule, Global Migration, Global Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism. So before introducing tonight's event and speaker, I want to acknowledge that our event is being organized and broadcasted to you today, this evening, from the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Wolastoqey. So Wolastoq means the beautiful and bountiful river in the Wolastoqey language. The lands in which the event organizers live are subject to the peace and friendship treaties signed in the 1700s between the British Crown, the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples. The peace and friendship treaties did not involve Indigenous peoples surrendering rights to the lands and resources. Rather, the treaties were signed in the spirit of peace and friendship for Indigenous peoples and settlers to coexist on the land. And we hope that tonight's event is part of honoring those treaties. So if this is the first time that you're joining a Tertulia, you might be wondering what a Tertulia is. So a Tertulia is a kind of philosophy cafe where people get together to talk about big thinkers, artists, and ideas. So a group of professors at St. Thomas University and the University of New Brunswick, including myself, Matthew Hayes, Christy Elaine, and Daniel Tubb organized a series with the support of St. Thomas University student Megan Hill. Our Tertulia series this winter is focused on the activists and social movements that have shaped our world and inspire us to create a better world. So our next Tertulia, which will be in 2 weeks at the same time, is with University of New Brunswick Law Professor Basil Alexander on Dudley George and the Ipperwash inquiry. So you can find the event details, including the Zoom link, on the MB Media Co-op website or on the Tertulia or MB Media Co-op Facebook event pages. So Tertulia's Fredericton is supported by the MB Media Co-op, publisher of videos of the Tertulia talks. It's also membership month at the MB Media Co-op. So if you're not already a member, you can support local media by going to mbmediacoop.org. So Tertulia's Fredericton is also supported by book publishers Fernwood, which is the publisher of Harsha Walia's book, along with Haymarket, as well as Between the Lines and Verso and Canadian Scholars Women's Press. So tonight, to ask questions and offer comments, please use the Zoom chat room or the comment on a section on the Facebook live stream. So we'll monitor these two spaces and ask you to voice your question at the end, or we can voice it for you. So now I'm going to turn it over to Olina Alaka, who's with Fernwood, and then Adi Rao with Known as Illegal Fredericton to provide further introductory remarks.
Thank you, Tracy. Hi, everyone. My name is Oyinda. I'm here today on behalf of Harsha Walia's publishers, Fernwood Publishing. I'm super excited to be at this event, and I'm very thankful for everything that the Tertulia group does to promote ideas and thinking. So we currently have an International Women's Day sale going on until March 13th. At 11:59 p.m. for 20% off any title on our website. So you can grab a copy of Border and Rule, which you should, via our website and get 20% off. So yes, we're super excited, as I said before, to have Asha's book. As you know, Asha is an exceptional person and she's someone I look up to, and I've learned a lot too from Asha. So super excited to hear more and hear Asha speak tonight. I would pass it on to Addie.
It is very much an immense privilege to be given this opportunity to welcome and introduce Harsha Walia to you all tonight on behalf of Known as Illegal Fredericton. Many members and supporters of Noe Fredericton are here tonight in strength. Noe is a loose collective and an international network of migrant justice activists who believe in a world where migrants can live free from state violence, colonialism, and capitalist oppression. Many of us here tonight will know Harsha Walia already as the award-winning author of Undoing Border Imperialism and recently as the executive director of the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association. Harsha is also a co-founder of Known as Illegal and an inspiration to many activists across the country and the world passionate about migrant justice. Harsha is a community organizer, a campaigner in anti-capitalist, feminist, migrant justice, and anti-imperialist movements. And as you've just heard, Harsha has just published a new book, Border and Rule. Now, if you're joining us from Montreal today, you should know that Solidarity Across Borders is currently selling her book as a fundraiser, but you can only access it if you live in Montreal. So if you're in Montreal and you want to support the important work that Solidarity Across Borders are doing, please send me a message in the chat. Harsha is trained in the law, and I'm among the people she inspired to get a legal education. You won't be surprised when I say then that Harsha's work is deeply personal to me. She's a sister of South Asian descent whose sense of justice is rooted in her community. Harsha sees what many fail to see in the migrant experience, that underneath the movement of people, their struggle to survive, their desire to lead a better life, is the force of an undercurrent of colonial borders and capitalist oppression, pulling and pushing people, sometimes to great heights, other times to great depths. Harsha sees the importance of organizing and solidarity across movements. She teaches young activists that the battles we fight cannot be fought alone. She tells us that no one is illegal, especially not on stolen land. Harsha understands that the victories won cannot be taken for granted and that losses sustained are lessons learned. This is why every time she speaks, she ends with a call to action, and I'm sure tonight will be no different. So I want to leave you all with a quote from her book, Undoing Border Imperialism. It's actually from the epilogue in that book that our brother Said Khalid Hassan wrote, reminding us of this ethos. We have to ensure that victories won are not slowly eroded, that our roots don't crumble underneath as we sit mesmerized by the fragrance of flowers on the trees. With that, it gives me great pleasure to welcome on behalf of Noe Fredericton, the extraordinary activist and organizer, who will no doubt inspire us all to act decisively for justice tonight, Harsha Walia.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for organizing, for all of your work and your labor to bring us all together. Thank you to everyone who's listening in on Zoom and folks who are on Facebook. And really just thank you so much, Noe Fredericton. Oyinda, thank you so much to Fernwood for all the kindness and the generosity Fernwood has shown this book, and to just so many comrades alongside, who write and who participate in struggles that are worthy of documenting. I'm here on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people and nations, the lands of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish nations, who continue to steward these lands and whose laws and jurisdiction continue to be alive on these lands. And thank you, as Adi said, for so much of my work, and more importantly of Known as Legal's work in migrant justice organizing in this country, has always been clear in standing alongside Indigenous nations, affirming Indigenous sovereignty, and really emphasizing that no one is illegal, Canada is illegal. And I think that is the spirit in which this book has been written, which is to think alongside migrant justice struggles in a global context, in the context of global imperialism, colonization, and capitalism, and to really try to get rid of the kind of ways in which our movements and our communities have been forced to be siloed, right? We often think of these as distinct communities and distinct phenomenon, when in fact they're completely intertwined in each other, and are not as contradictory as they may seem. So I'm speaking for a little bit, and then I appreciate that this is Philosopher's Cafe style, and so we're gonna get into some conversation, which I'm keen on. I'd love to know what people are thinking, and how we can continue talking around this. So I will try to keep my comments brief. And I'll start by saying that the premise of Border and Rule is really a no border politics. And so it's laying out the reasons that I think it's really important to imagine a world without borders. And that may seem like a fundamentally illogical or utopic vision that's not attainable. But I think it is so important to remember how new state borders are in our human history, and how fundamentally tied they are to state violence, right? So if we believe in dismantling capitalism, if we believe in dismantling police and prisons, as we're increasingly seeing with the upsurge of abolitionist struggles and abolitionist philosophies, if we believe in dismantling imperialism and all the kind of global web of power, then having a world without borders is a fundamental pillar of that. But oftentimes it's like the last thing that even people on the left are willing to take on as part of their political vision. And so for me, Border and Rule is an attempt to lay out a map for why we urgently need to think of a world with no borders, which is distinct than only a world of open borders, right? And we can get into that, the kind of distinction between no borders and open borders. But for me, no borders is a much more expansive political vision. I start the book off with a story that, just lingered at me for years and years. And, in addition to being a migrant justice organizer, I also spent, well over a decade, almost 2 decades, organizing in Vancouver's downtown east side, which is an inner city neighborhood that is, that is known around the city, certainly within Vancouver, across BC, and really even across the country in Canada, as one of the so-called poorest neighborhoods in Canada, right? So it's a neighborhood that's marked by high rates of forced impoverishment, homelessness, people in the informal trade, whether that's in the drug trade or sex trade, high rates of homelessness and police violence. And so I've been involved in that neighborhood for many years. And the story that I tell is of a time where I was involved in supporting and organizing an anti-gentrification rally that was being organized by predominantly Indigenous elders in the neighborhood. And I was speaking on a conservative talk show radio against my better judgment, never go on one of those, but decided to. And, when I got on, this caller baited me, and they baited me by being, by basically saying, you believe in no one is illegal. I've heard you on the radio, constantly squawking about no one is illegal and how people should be allowed to move anywhere they want. So how can you suddenly say that gentrifiers aren't welcome? And then they proceeded to say, isn't that you just acting like the border guards that you are constantly railing about? And this nagged at me for months, right? Because although this was very clearly a conservative talk show and I was being baited, it nagged at me because, it's even in the left, there is a sense that actually borders serve a progressive purpose, right? And especially in the current context of globalized capital, where capital moves freely, there are many in the left who think that actually borders can serve an anti-capitalist function or an anti-colonial function, because the preventing of free movement somehow gets equated with foreign invaders and gentrifiers, right? So migrants suddenly become equated with gentrifiers when in fact they have nothing in common with gentrifiers, right? Migrants and refugees on the move are the victims of racial capitalism. They're not the perpetrators of racial capitalism. And so it really compelled me to think and write more deeply, to really make the case, as of course many organizers do, but to a broader audience, about how we need to understand the border as so central to so much state and capital violence in the world. And that it's not just about a line on a map. And it's not even about the politics of movement per se. It's about something so much bigger and so much more expansive that we need to be thinking about. And so, this book, I'll say, it's also an internationalist vision. I try not to focus only on the US and Canada, and really look at places around the world in an effort to think about borders as structures that exist across geography. And I think that's especially important for those of us in Canada for 2 reasons, right? One is that oftentimes whenever there's a politician that is introducing a new immigration reform, and it's particularly regressive, in Canada, we're very quick to remark that that's an American import, right? That Canada's importing racial violence from the United States. And of course, this was really heightened in the era of Trump, where we really kind of blamed the escalation of racial violence on Donald Trump, which means that, of course, we then invisibilize and obscure Canada's own role in perfecting racial capitalist violence, right? So Canada, of course, has perfected technologies of settler colonialism. Canada is deeply complicit in enslavement and the ongoing suppression of Black liberation, of Indigenous sovereignty, and is very much involved in imperial projects around the world. So by focusing on the kind of Canada-US dynamic, we tend to obscure Canada's role in violence. And the other is that oftentimes by only focusing on Canada, we don't always see what's happening around the world. And so for me, I really wanted to emphasize and look at the ways in which border structures are mimicked and travel all around the world. So just to talk a little bit about, why I think it's so important to have a no border politics, and why migrants are not gentrifiers, is that, there's a few key things that I think we need to be thinking about. And, one of them is that, of course, we're in the midst since 2015 of what globally a lot of politicians and elite speak of as the migrant crisis, or interchangeably as the migrant invasion, or interchangeably as the border crisis or the refugee crisis, right? There's a lot of stories about the migrant crisis, a lot of stories about people dying at the borders, of drownings in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean continues to be the world's deadliest border. And, these stories have actually served, I think, a very dangerous purpose, which is that instead of actually ensuring that people can move safely, they've actually served to securitize borders more. And a report just came out yesterday where internationally, human rights experts and refugee experts, even in the most mainstream kind of organizations, are saying that the crisis that refugees and migrants are facing is unparalleled and unprecedented in the past 100 years. Like that the crisis of displacement is astounding. And, what happens when we talk about migrant or refugee crisis is suddenly the migrant becomes the crisis, the refugee becomes the crisis, without actually talking about the underlying crisis that has created migration and displacement. So suddenly our focus ends up on the migrant subject, the refugee subject, and the gaze is focused on people on the move, when in fact the gaze and our kind of attention needs to be on those systemic forces that are compelling people to move. And so I think it's more accurate to reframe the migration crisis as one of displacement and immobility, because migration suggests also that people can move, when in fact the reality is the vast majority of the millions of people who are displaced are immobilized, are not able to move freely, are immobilized within state borders, or are immobilized in massive kind of carceral refugee camps that are sites of containment and control. And so I think it's really important that we name the crisis not as that of migration, which is natural, but we name the crisis as displacement and implicate those forces of global imperialism, of war, of occupation, right? It is not a coincidence that the most prolonged refugee crisis in the world is that of Palestinians, right? Who continue to be occupied, who continue to face the Israeli apartheid regime, whose lands continue to be occupied. So these are not coincidences. And it's not a coincidence that the vast majority of the millions of people who are displaced on this planet are people whose histories and whose lands have been marked by asymmetries of power, right? It's Black and brown people. It's people from the so-called global South, which is not a geography, right? It's the global South is not about geography. It's about a power dynamic. And it's about people who are primarily poor, right? Rich people can travel on tourist visas, can travel in luxury, in luxury yachts, can afford air travel. We're talking about asymmetries of power. And so it is so important that when we're talking about immigration and we're talking about borders, we understand the ways in which borders have served to maintain the system of global apartheid, where really the luck of the draw of where you are born will have such a huge impact and significance about what kind of life you will lead, right? And what your life is going to look like is based on the geography of where you are born, really, which isn't to overdetermine people's future, but to say that that is a reality. And so for me, thinking about migration in this kind of global perspective is important, because a lot of times immigration takes on a very domesticated framework, which is that we think about, and we often hear center leftists response to the overt right being like, oh no, but we need immigrants. They contribute to the economy, or, let's increase the quota. And it becomes these very liberal, benevolent, humanitarian gestures that are supposed to be counters to the far right, but really maintain that same system of power, right? Which is who gets to decide who is moving. If the center left and centrist, in the case of Canada, the Liberal Party, or even the NDP says, no, the Conservatives are racist. They're wrong in their anti-migrant rhetoric. We believe we should be welcoming to refugees. And that's Trudeau's line, right? Trudeau built his entire campaign around refugees welcome, while continuing the same kind of policies of the Safe Third Country Agreement, of detention and deportation, more deportations now during the pandemic than any single year in the past decade almost. But especially maintaining state power and racial capitalist power and white supremacist power to determine who has the right to move and who doesn't, right? So the state, and in this case, Canada, still is the arbiter of who moves and under what conditions. And so I think an internationalist view on migration moves us from a politics of charity or liberalism to one of restitution and reparations and responsibility, where we see how we are actually bound up and complicit in the violences of why people move, right? Canada is a headquarter of mining, right? Mining operations, 70% of the world's mining operations are headquartered in Canada, which means that when people are displaced, when their lands are being wrecked, when their lives are ruined, when their non-capitalist communal land-based economies are devastated, we have a responsibility, right? This is not about charity. It's not about benevolence. It's not about quotas. We have a responsibility to right that wrong. And that takes two forms. And which is the second part of what I think is so important about no border politics, which is that the freedom to move and the freedom to stay are fundamentally intertwined corollaries, right? That when we fight for the people to move, it means that we're also fighting for the right for people to stay, which means that no one should be forcibly displaced, that we are fighting, Canadian complicity abroad in terms of our foreign policies, in terms of our economic devastation, in terms of our war, our arms trade with Saudi Arabia, our free trade agreements around the planet, that we are ensuring that we are not responsible, that our governments are not responsible for wreaking havoc around the world, and also that people have the right to move. So these are not contradictory. I think that in no border politics, the necessary corollaries are that people have the right to stay and people have the right to move, or rather the freedom to stay and the freedom to move. So I think, that kind of global perspective on borders is so necessary in order to come to that realization. Otherwise, we perpetuate that kind of liberal generosity, multiculturalism kind of politics. The two other things that I'll say are really pivotal to understanding borders, especially in our contemporary era, is the connection to imperialism. So of course, I've just touched on why a lot of people, and one of the kind of main propellers of people being forcibly displaced is, of course, imperialism, right? And the power dynamics of imperial power. But I also think there's another piece of this that we often miss, and we often miss this on the left in these kinds of debates about whether imperialism is still a kind of worthy political point of analysis, right? So there's many who believe that we live in a kind of post-imperial era with diffuse power. And I think that's not true. And one of the ways in which that is starkly evident to be not true is if we look at how the outsourcing of borders is increasingly central to maintaining imperial relationships. And by that, I mean, increasingly, we see countries like Canada, countries like the United States, Fortress EU, the European Union, Australia, all outsourcing their border enforcement to third countries. In the case of the United States, that's things like Trump's Remain in Mexico protocols, right? Where Mexican authorities and Mexican border authorities are paid to enforce American enforcement policies. And this did not start under Trump. It was actually perfected under President Obama. In Australia, we see this with Australia paying countries like Papua New Guinea and Nauru to accept Australian detention centers. In the EU, we see this in the Sahel region with the EU making it a condition. It is now a condition of almost every single EU trade and aid and development agreement with countries in the Middle East and countries in the Sahel region in Africa. It is a condition of almost every single trade and aid and development agreement that the EU has with these countries that they will have migration prevention protocols, right? So if you are going to be entering into a trade and aid agreement as, as Libya, as Mauritania, as Tunisia, with the EU, you can almost always be sure to see a clause or multiple clauses and whole section that requires you to prevent migration into the EU and to accept expelled deportees from the EU, right? So we can increasingly see how migration prevention, which is a euphemism, right? It's a euphemism for apartheid. Migration prevention is becoming a pillar of maintaining global imperial relations. So it's not only that imperialism is the cause of forced displacement, but also that migration prevention and the outsourcing of borders is increasingly becoming a central pillar of maintaining imperial relations. And this is vast because I would argue, and many others have argued as well, that the new frontiers of border militarization are not even countries in the so-called global north anymore. It is countries in the global south who have their own interests and also are beholden to much stronger imperial interests to become the front lines of border militarization, right? And again, we see that in countries like Libya, right? All of the shocking and horror stories that we see of migrants and detainees, especially who are African. 96% of those who are trapped in Libya in horrific conditions of torture, confinement, enslavement, and more are African, are from 26 countries in the African continent. And Libya gets billions of euros from the EU to enact these policies, right? And the outsourcing of border enforcement also, of course, serves another function, which is to suddenly wipe our hands off of that violence, right? To say we're not responsible for this. This is happening in a third world country, right? The EU is somehow not responsible for what's happening in Libya. Trump and the US and now Biden are somehow not responsible for what's happening in Mexico when Central American migrants are being tear gassed by US funded forces of Mexican enforcement, right? So it's really important to see how borders and migration prevention, as it's euphemistically called, is increasingly a pillar of global relations. And within all of this, migrants have become bargaining chips, right? They become bargaining chips where countries bargain on the lives of migrants by saying, we promise to detain X thousands of people, give us more money, EU, right? Like that literally happened when Gaddafi, for example, threatened the EU and extorted the EU and said, give us more euros or quote unquote, we will turn Europe into Africa, right? So this kind of extortion, or we see with Erdogan in Turkey. So this is really important, I think, for us to understand. The last thing that I'll emphasize in terms of understanding bordering regimes is that, bordering regimes are not, and outsourcing of borders is a clear example of this. Borders are not just maps on a line, right? Bordering regimes exist at the border, outside of the border, inside of the border. They multiply and they're everywhere. And again, outsourcing of borders is a clear example of that, right? You're suddenly contending with US border enforcement, even though you're not even close to the US-Mexico border. And this is important because a lot of times the symbolism of the wall, for example, is what we fixate on, but really bordering regimes are everywhere. And the second thing I think is really important is how central migration is to racial capitalism. And I mentioned this earlier, which is that there are certain segments of the left who think that in response to globalized capital, that border enforcement will somehow protect against global capital. And that kind of really traditional Keynesian view on the possibility of nationalism as a countering force to capital. And I think that that's a flawed logic. And there's many ways in which we could talk about that being a flawed logic, but I think the salient one, particularly as it relates to racial capitalism, is that of labor migration. And labor migration is increasingly becoming a central method of capitalism. Labor migration is, state-conscripted state programs of what we know in Canada as the temporary foreign worker program, where migrant workers who come in legally authorized by the state to work under essentially conditions of indentureship, right? So you are essentially indentured to an employer. you are held under really horrific conditions where we're not being paid minimum wage is the norm, where people are often confined. It's not an exaggeration to say that many labor migration programs are conditions of confinement. In many parts of the world, employers will not allow people, like particularly domestic workers, for example, or agricultural workers in labor camps, to leave the site where they are contained. A report in Lebanon that was done with domestic workers there under the kafala system was called "Their Home is My Prison," right? And that wasn't an analogy. The domestic workers reported not leaving the home for over 2 years. Oh, am I still frozen? Am I unfrozen? Oh, I just got a thing saying I was frozen. And so, temporary labor migration is so central to racial capitalism because in that case, the border acts as a spatial fix, right? So when capital is looking for, as we know, capital is constantly looking for cheapened labor, right? I won't say cheap labor. No labor is cheap, but capital creates the conditions of cheapened labor. And the border, that's the function that the border serves. Because think about it, right? Migrant workers work in our communities, work alongside us. And so in terms of the border, we think about migrant workers, these are folks and workers who live and work alongside other workers in the Canadian nation state. Yet somehow they are legally segregated into a completely different workforce, right? They're somehow seen as temporary, seen as migrant. And here migrant becomes, again, basically a euphemism for third world workers, right? And so this is what is so central to racial capitalism, is the ability to create a so-called third world workforce in the so-called first world, right? The ability to create a differentiated, different pool of labor who are not coincidentally, of course, racialized, because labor relies on and capitalism relies on racism, right? It relies on racism in order to extract and exploit. And then to be able to say that these migrant workers, though they are laboring within the nation state, are somehow not subject to any of the same labor rights, any of the same public services as other people in Canada, because they are migrant workers, right? And so migrant workers and labor migration programs are the flip side of outsourcing, in the same way that the state and capital requires outsourced labor, right? So we outsource production to the so-called third world because of cheapened labor, because of free trade agreements that allow things like export processing zones, because of free trade agreements that allow for union-free zones, right? Like that's what NAFTA does. That's what export processing, that's what the World Bank, structural adjustment, all of these policies are about privatization and creating the conditions of precarious labor. So the labor that cannot be outsourced is then insourced, right? Domestic work, construction work, agricultural work, etc. And so it is so important that we not see the border as a way of resolving the contradictions of capitalism. The border is a method for capital. And the only way that we ensure that the rights of all workers are protected is by lifting the wage floor for all workers, by refusing to see migrant workers as so-called migrant workers, to refuse to see them as so-called third world workers, but to see them in the internationalist struggle of workers, right? That all workers around the world have the right to a life with dignity, to collective bargaining rights, to fight against the interests of capital. And so, I think if we look at the way in which the border actually plays a key role in the exploitation of migrant workers, then we start to see that we cannot, in fact, rely on the border as a way to ease or to stop or to reduce the harms of capital, because the border is a method of capital. And labor migration is increasingly becoming the method of racial capitalism in our world today, as states look to labor migration as a way to cheapen labor, right? And this is especially true if we look at domestic work. Internationally, now over 70% of all domestic workers around the world are migrant workers. And this is not a coincidence, right? Because states have realized that labor migration is labor flexibility. We know labor flexibility is always in the interest of capital. It does not mean flexibility or rights for workers. And in this case, Canada is really central for Canadians to understand, because Canada has actually perfected the model. Like all around the world, Canada's temporary foreign worker program is known as the gold standard and is known as the Rolls Royce, in the words of one international meeting. Canada's model was the Rolls Royce. And of course, that's not because Canada treats workers well, it's because Canada has perfected the system of labor migration where year after year, generation after generation, when it comes to agricultural workers, workers are disposed of and expendable, right? And on this constant circuit of labor migration and so-called labor flexibility, which is deeply racialized. And so, these are some of the reasons and some of the underlying pinnings of borders and border politics that I think we need to grapple with. Because if we start to see how central borders are to racial capitalism, in the case of labor migration, if we start to see and understand how central borders are now to maintaining imperialism around the world through these kinds of trade and aid agreements where migration prevention is central to these agreements, when we start to see the devastation of climate change and political displacement and economic displacement as driving force displacement, then I think we cannot argue for anything but a world without borders, right? That is the minimum. That is the starting point, because maintaining the border in any form, there is no reforming it. Maintaining the border in any form is a form of violence. It maintains state violence, it maintains apartheid, and it maintains racial capitalism. And so we absolutely need to get behind a vision of no borders. And one of the quotes that I love and I use in both books is a quote from Eduardo Galeano, and I'll close with his words, which is like, ultimately, this all comes down to, and I'll say it in his words, he says, the world was born yearning to be a home for everyone. The world was born yearning to be a home for everyone. And I think if we think of a no border politics as the politics of making home, as the politics of ensuring that everybody has a home, that no one is displaced from their home, that everyone is able to live in a home, that no one is houseless, no one is homeless, no one is landless, no one is forcibly displaced, that people are able to move in order to find home, to be with their family, to be with their kin, to find a new life, that ultimately all of that is about being and finding and making home. And I think for me, that is why a politics, again, of no borders is so essential, because if we are committed to a world in which people are free, in which people are liberated, where the kinds of, the differences, the social organization of difference, the hierarchies, the oppression of racism, of patriarchy, of class, and more, these are all structured through borders, and that we cannot have a world where we are free and where everybody is free unless we have a world without borders. And I think, again, that for me is the big idea, that we have to commit to a world without borders. It has to be part of an anti-capitalist, it has to be part of all anti-capitalist work. It has to be part of all anti-imperialist work. It has to be part of an abolitionist politics. And then, again, to close with the words of Eduardo Galeano, the world was born yearning to be a home for everyone. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Harsha. That was an amazing talk, very informative, touched on a lot of important issues. The way that we usually operate for questions and answers here is that if anyone has any questions or comments, they can post them in the chat function. If you're not familiar with the chat function, I think we all are now with Zoom, but you'll find it at the bottom of the screen by moving your mouse around or your mouse pad or what have you. And we'll take those as they come up. We'll ask you to voice them, and then Harsha can respond. So don't waste any time here. Harsha, one of the things that I really found interesting about your talk, I mean, it kind of evokes a vision of the globe that is one that the left is not familiar with, or has lost kind of familiarity with. The idea that that racial capitalism is fundamentally built on a history of colonization and whatnot. How has that also contributed to the kind of current histories of migration to different countries in the world, and what are the kind of colonial roots of migration? Which would include, myself as a white settler. Throughout most of the history of migration, if we include settlement, that's not been a problem at all. It seems that it's a more recent problem. Right, we've got a question from Alex Corey.
Oh, should I answer that, or should I take the next question?
If you've got anything to say, and then we can go to Alex.
Sure. I'll answer briefly. I mean, I think, yeah, it's, exactly as you said. I think the thing that's really the most ironic about the kind of current invocations of the migration crisis is precisely that. It ignores the history of, movement of many forms, and really treats migration as a new crisis in a way that is offensive, because it ignores the histories of indentureship, ignores the histories of enslavement, and completely ignores settler colonialism as three of the primary foundations of world history today, right? Like, we're talking about the enslavement and trafficking of millions of Africans. We're talking about the indentureship of millions of Asians. And parallel to those processes, we're talking about the settlement by Europeans across the Pacific and Oceania regions, right? North America, South America, and Oceania. And so it's deeply offensive to think about migration as like a new crisis without locating the current migration crisis, or displacement crisis, as I would call it, in these historic trajectories. And of course, the kinds of same patterns that we see historically are the ones that are continuing today, right? So settlers, and here, people who represent and who are close and embedded within racial capitalism, who are adjacent to whiteness, who are close to whiteness, who have capital, are of course able to move, right? It's not that no one is able to move. We know that if you have a Western passport, you have like basically mobility-free access to the world, right? You don't need visas. You don't know the experience of standing in a line and being denied a visa. That's not an experience most people have. And so it's that same, those same kinds of movements are open door for some and closed for others. And the same conditions of confinement, or I shouldn't say same, but similar conditions of precarity and confinement underwrite some people's mobility over others, right? So again, temporary labor migration as a contemporary form of indentureship. But it's sold as free, which is what indentureship was sold as, right? We were told that indentureship was people freely entering into labor contracts, that people were willingly entering into employment contracts. That was the narrative around indentureship, and that is the current day narrative around labor migration. And in that way, there is no difference, right? It's just state and capital power on steroids in a new form, in a new era, but the kind of underpinnings of that exploitation remain the same. While of course, settler movement continues to be lauded. People, settlers got free land and got the vote hundreds of years ago, and that's still the reality. You can buy your way through a citizenship investment program, right? You can become a national of almost every country if you invest enough money. And again, you're adjacent to the racial social order of what that requires. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely. Alex.
Hi, thank you, Harsha. I was excited to see you talk, and you've delivered a impassioned, and I mean that in the best sense, call for a better world. And I share, in terms of the end goal, I share, we're on the same page, although I have questions about how it is we get from where it is we are right now, which is a Zoom conference with 26 participants, to the world that we want to see in the sort of desiderata with, you know, no borders, etc. And specifically in terms of when you're, some of the concepts that are being used to understand the current crisis, they remind me a bit of a liberal perspective from Branko Milanovic, on when he talks about citizenship premium and how, you know, the Western workers are benefiting from a citizenship premium at the expense of the racialized people of the world, women, etc. And that sort of beginning point allows him to argue for actually for temporary foreign worker programs, for as a way of leveling the globe in a manner that is going to accommodate the current tensions that emerge from heightened migration. So I'm not saying I agree with him, but I'm saying that there's a commonality in the starting point, and that the concepts of like global south, global apartheid fail to identify some of the fact that the citizenship premium is really the result of years of struggle, and of course a struggle in a relatively privileged position, but years of struggle for improved citizenship rights and for improved labor responsibilities or labor rights in the globe, in the West. So in terms of how do you manage an internationalist struggle, when labor is currently contained within borders, I don't see how, if in any given nation there were to be who is the we that is able to be the agent that is responsible to correct colonization and imperialism. The only agent that I see that could possibly do that would have to be allied to the working class, including you know, a lot of white people, and that their relative privilege would have to be challenged, but they would be struggling within a border, and the result of their struggle would then still be within a border, and they would still need to maintain power within that border. So I don't see how borders immediately correspond to the same political project that arises at the same end. Okay, sorry, that was long. Thank you for your presentation. Again, we share the same goals.
Thank you. I'll try to respond to that. There was a lot in there. So please jump in if I forgot any part. I guess I would say, yeah, I don't know the person that you were speaking of earlier, but there are many commentators who do suggest that temporary labor migration is for the benefit of workers. That's a very common kind of refrain. But I maintain that it is not, and that in fact, you know, if it was beneficial to workers, then workers would have the full rights, including full labor rights and status, right? Like that is the starting point. And here, if we look at the good work of the Migrant Rights Network nationally, which includes almost every single migrant worker organization in this country, there's a unified demand, which is for right to unionization, full labor rights, full social rights, and immigration status for all. Because the lack of immigration status is precisely what other rights are contingent on, right? The right to unionize, the right to access EI, the right to access welfare, etc., healthcare is all contingent on the right to status. And so I think that is. I think that starting premise I would disagree with, but I think the argument that labor is confined within a border, I think is restrictive, because I don't think labor is confined within a border. If we think about if we think about labor as everything that is produced that we are then connected to, it is just not true, right? Like if we think about the amount of labor that is outsourced that Canadians rely on, it's immense. And so I think what makes it seem impossible that we can organize as the working class or as laborers who actually share the production line is the border. It's what makes it seem impossible that someone like me sitting in Vancouver is somehow more connected to someone in Canada as the working class than, say, someone in China or someone in India as part of the working class. The only thing that allows for that to seem impossible is the political constraints are in imagination because of the border, right? Like what is implausible about organizing as the working class across borders other than the border itself, right? And so I don't think labor is bounded in the nation state, other than the fact that the regime of how labor is controlled is mediated by the welfare state or the nation state. But it's just not true that workers of the world are not connected. Workers of the world are absolutely connected. And I do think lifting the wage floor for all workers is beneficial to all workers, right? Like that would make insourcing and outsourcing obsolete. And again, especially if we're thinking about migrant workers, I think, the call by organizations like the Migrant Rights Network, by MWAC, I think it's so imperative that we fight for status for all migrant workers to ensure that they do have the same rights to unionization, that they do have the same rights. But I don't think that labor is bounded by the state. I think labor is controlled by the nation state and by the border, but I don't think it's bounded by it, in my view.
Sorry, if I could just direct to that. That is the point, though. The thing that you're struggling directly against is the state with its institutions that confine labor as working people within a border. And so, of course, I'm for international collaboration organization for a global international proletarian revolution. But I mean, of course, but but when the concrete working people are struggling, what they're struggling against is a nation state. They're struggling within borders in that sense. And very concretely and practically, if they were to overthrow that nation state and institute their own political power block, then they would still be confined by by their neighboring nation states. And then they would need to have an international collaboration with the workers in the neighboring states they would support in overthrowing their own repressive regimes. But the internationalist aspect of it means that they would also need to control that border in terms of who comes across it, because there's going to be counter-revolutionaries who want to cross back in. Like Cuba can't just let everyone in, they can't, because there are organized efforts to overthrow and murder the leadership. Anyway, we're not going to come to an agreement, I don't think.
No, probably not. And I mean, the one thing that I think is important to understand is I don't think state borders are the same as people controlling their communities, right? A lot of Indigenous communities control access to their territories. That's not the same as a state border, which is why it's important to understand state borders in the context of not just territories or line on a map, but as central to race and capitalism and imperialism. And the other thing that I will say is, when we're talking about the global working class, we are talking about a majority of the world that is racialized and a majority of the world that is women. And I think the kind of nostalgia around the working class being white men, and this idea that the working classes in Western countries has built up, which is the second point that I was going to raise, is this idea that citizenship has been fought for and that the rights of citizenship have been fought for by the working class. I think we also have to push back against a little and push back against the nostalgia of that, because the working class and the economies, more importantly, of Western states have been built on plunder. And they've been built on the plunder of Indigenous nations. They've been built on enslavement. They've been built on imperialism around the world. And so those people have never been the beneficiaries of the citizenship rights that the working class may have a kind of nostalgia to or have access to, right? People have never benefited from that. Countries in the global south who have been plundered in order for the US and Canada to build up its economies have never had access to the citizenship of these countries. And that is why a no borders politics is fundamentally about reparations, because we cannot talk about the working class in the so-called Western world without talking about the ways in which it is fundamentally bound up in the labor of people in the global south and of Indigenous and Black communities within the nation state. But I know that there's other people, so.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the interesting question as well, Alex. So right now we have Tracy, and then we have Gil.
Oh, okay. So I was just, wondering with COVID, whether you think there's more or less room for no border politics, whether like thinking of just that people who for the first time had to think about immobility, whether that may inspire a no border politics. I don't know. Or maybe there's a downside too that you want to talk about.
It's a good question. I don't know. I don't know what people will take from this, right? And that's like part of the organizing is, that's the work of organizers, is to try to take the current condition and hope that it, it turns into more of a revolutionary force than a reactionary force. And that's always the case for any crisis is, will this be something that we learn from in order to not return to the normal, or will this be a reactionary turn to the normal? And I think the most kind of hopeful example, but who knows? Ask me another day, I might have a different answer. But I think, for example, with all this talk about people being in lockdown, one would hope that people would start to realize what confinement actually means, right? Like, we're not actually on lockdown. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and some of our mobility is constrained. That's not actually the same as being on lockdown in a prison or a detention center. It's not the same as a condition of confinement. But I would hope that experience into what people feel is lockdown would actually lend itself to solidarity with people who are actually on lockdown, right? And similarly, I hope that kind of experience, as you put it, around immobility will give people a window into what, actual immobility, for lack of a better word, what that is, and people will start to think about, oh, I couldn't take my vacation. That is a luxury. But if you can't take your vacation, imagine what it's like for people who can't actually move because they're fleeing for their life, right? Like people who need to move for safety. Or if people have been constrained for seeing their family, but are still relatively safe. What does it mean when you're not safe and you're not able to move? So I hope, but we also know that power reconfigures itself and the narrative is immense. And so I don't know. I don't know, but I think that's part of organizing is, taking the current moment and building towards something that's not a return to the normal.
Okay, good. Chalishkan, you have a question too.
Yeah. Hi, Harsha. It's an honor really to listen to you tonight. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm one of the members of No One is Illegal Fredericton, and I have a question, not question, but rather your reflection around having to feel that tension between reactionary work and revolutionary work in labor justice movement. We all have to engage in both, right? So while imagining a different world, unfortunately, we have to also, maybe fortunately, also have to invest in reactionary work. So in terms of labor justice, migrant justice movement, and No One is Illegal in particular, how do you see in new era of neoliberal globalization, the solidarity work is changing? What are some of the promises we have and challenges we have as labor migrant justice activists? So your reflections on future of solidarity work in this field. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And thank you for being involved in knowing movements. I think, for me, when I think about, as you put it, the kind of reactionary versus revolutionary tendencies, I most currently would, and because it's so great and useful and practical for organizers, is critical resistance has a really great toolkit, right, around what kind of reforms are reformist and what kinds of reforms are non-reformist. And here I think, of course, all organizing has a revolution, that has a revolutionary aim, contends with the practicalities of day to day, right? Like, of course, we're dealing with the state, and that goes back to Alex's point. But I think there's a difference between engaging with reforms that expand the possibility of revolution versus engaging with reforms that re-entrench the status quo, right? And I can, there's many examples, but I can give you one that's all off the top of my head right now, which is, in known as Legal Vancouver a few years ago, we were doing work in a community, and we found out from the detention center that a detainee had committed suicide. And this was Lucia Vega Jimenez, who people may have later heard about. And so she died in detention center. She took her own life because she was facing a deportation. And this resulted in a massive public inquest that then led to this new national detention framework. And at the time, there was tons of reforms that were being floated around, right? Like, our vision, of course, was to end all immigration detention, was to abolish all borders. And of course, we demanded that in our submission, but knowing that the state, is not going to take that up. We were also thoughtful about, what kinds of realistic, immediate reforms are possible, and which ones would increase the possibility of freedom for detainees and which ones would decrease it. And that was the guiding question. And I think for me, that's often the guiding question in this kind of reactionary versus revolutionary debate, or reform versus revolution debate, is not to say, I don't think they're dichotomies. I think they exist on a spectrum. And the question is, which one gets us closer to revolution and which one takes us backward or maintains the status quo? And so, in that example, the kinds of reforms that we said, it's not enough, but yes, it's, of course, this is needed, is, access to lawyers, more telephone access, more library access, right? Like, these are all things that make it more possible for detainees to access the outside world. The ones that we did not agree with was the ones that increased the net of criminalization. So we did not agree with, for example, electronic monitoring as a alternative to detention, right? Because you've gone from being in a detention center to like caging yourself or having your family become your jail guards. And so I think those are the kinds of questions, right? Like, what takes us towards our vision and what takes us back? And I think that is a key question for solidarity movements. And I think that's one way to tackle it. And I think the other conundrum, for which I have no answer, it's a perennial question, is, the degree to which it can become very easy in migrant justice work to do the work of social workers, right? Like, to become unpaid service providers. And it's very important that we serve our communities. It's very important that we provide tangible, provide tangible support. But it's also a way for the state to maintain austerity. To be like, oh, do this unpaid community work, right? And so I think keeping support work politicized, keeping it connected to the goal, keeping it part of political momentum, and not having it just become like charity work, I think is another key constant question.
You just raised another important piece of that puzzle, is the activist fatigue, right? So really doing this work and allowing ourselves as activists take time to maybe step back time to time and come back to it. It is, that's another piece of the puzzle I find, like almost like it's in cycles. Maybe sometimes it is very powerful, strong moment. At some points, you said it's not really dichotomy, but when we need to react and take action, it just kind of brings us together, and it almost brings a momentum. But real revolutionary work. It is really maintaining it in between, and that is tiring work. So, and also activist fatigue is an issue too sometimes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that insight.
Thank you. Good. We've got a couple of questions from Facebook Live, Harsha. We've got a bit of a following on Facebook Live as well. So there are two questions. Why don't I give them both to you?
Sure. Yeah.
So the first one from Karen Morrell is, do you believe that removal of global borders and freedom of global movement will resolve the problems of living conditions globally? So that is a quick question. It's not a whole lot longer, but a slightly longer question from Mike Ashfield. The question, he said that he's very much enjoying your talk. Does something as strong as no border politics follow from taking national responsibility for complicity in the causes that have displaced people? To take your example, Canada's laissez-faire approach to Canadian mining companies gives the persons wronged by those practices in certain countries a claim against Canada, but it doesn't give just anyone a claim against Canada. So even if Canada has no right to enforce its borders against those persons wronged by Canadian mining companies, it doesn't follow that Canada can't enforce its border against anyone at all. But maybe so many of these complicities add up that they make it all but impossible to justify enforcing the border against persons anywhere. I'm not sure if that is referring to something that perhaps you have written about somewhere, but if you can address that, that would be great.
Sure. I'll try to answer it the way that I understand it, but please chime in, whoever asked those questions, to tell me if I'm on the wrong track. But yeah, I mean, I think that's precisely it, I think. And on the second question, which is that, mining is just one example, but if we add up all of their complicities and historic and contemporary complicities around the world, then yes, I think, then the not enforcing borders is a form of reparations for all of these massive complicities that are, again, historic and contemporary, right? It's not about just one person. It's about ravaging entire communities. And again, this global system. And so I think, yes, which is why, for me, I think the freedom to stay, which is, the freedom to not be displaced, is part of and a corollary to the freedom to move, right? That we have to fight for people to be able to stay in their homes. And the question of, will the dismantling of borders change living conditions globally? What I would emphasize there is that it's not just about having no borders and maintaining everything else the same in the world, right? It's not about having no borders, but continuing to mine and bomb and pollute the rest of the planet. It's not about having no borders, but continuing to maintain sweatshops. It's that no borders is part of a much more global vision where, put simply, we are all able to live better lives on this planet, including with non-human kin, right? So for me, a no border politics is not just removing the symbol of the border, which is what an open borders politics is, right? Open borders is like, let's leave the world the way it is and just open the border and let people move where they will. That's not what a no border politic is. A no border politics is that we make a border obsolete because we live in a radically different way. And that the differences that exist between the so-called South and so-called North are obsolete. The differences between, what it would mean to earn a wage in one part of the world is not different, radically different as it is as we see today, right? Which is why I think open borders freaks people out, right? Because of course, what's people's first instinct, which, really has a lot of underlying racial tones, deeply racist, unexamined racism, but really it's the instinct of like, oh my God, if we opened up the border, everyone from the world would come to live here, right? And it's like, well, again, there's a racism to that, like the rest of the world will overrun us and people will try to say it's about space and other things. But also, what is the assumption? That the rest of the world will come to live here, right? The assumption is that the rest of the world will come to live here because the rest of the world has an economy that's been devastated, right? And so talking about a no border politics is about not being okay with the majority of the world being forced to live in conditions of impoverishment and violence and war that we are complicit in. And so I think that for me is what a no border politics is. It's not just about let's open up the border and, you know, the so-called third world will come to the so-called global north. It's about radically even changing the conditions of possibility that make the South and the North, right? Like making that, overturning that, dismantling that, transforming that global reality.
So having a no border world then really implies a number of other things as well, of tackling racial capitalism, dealing with global inequalities, reparations, and so on. Yeah.
Climate change, yeah, all of it.
Yeah, climate change for sure. Let me see. There's a couple of other questions here. Daniel, I wanna go to you first, and then Mike Ashfield on Facebook Live. Also, he said that the answer to the question was very helpful, and he had a follow-up. But I'm going to go to Daniel first, just so that we've got enough time for everyone who wants to ask a first question.
Sure, I just put it in the chat. I'll try and ask it. My children may make lots of noise, but they may not. So my question is about thinking of borders in the nation state at a certain level. If a nation is an imagined community, a kind of extension of kinship, as anthropologists think about it, might borders be part of a process of creating group membership? I'll get to my question. There are members of the imagined community of a nation, and there are those who are outside of that imagination. If this is the case, could one imagine that a no border politics also abolition of the nation state? Perhaps not a bad thing, but can one just have half measures, or does a no border world require a world without nations?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it requires a world without nation states as we know it. Yeah. And I don't think that that is contradictory to people thinking about community. Let me just relook at that question. I don't think that's, you know, contradictory to people thinking about community or creating group membership. But I think what has happened is borders have replaced our ability to think about community kinship, right? Like the idea that I share a passport with somebody, therefore I'm in community with them. Even though I may not actually know anything about them or have any tangible relationship to them. But, you know, I don't think it precludes people creating community membership. And, you know, here I can offer the example of, you know, the Wet'suwet'en Nation in interior northern BC, the province of so-called BC. And I'm guessing people are familiar because, you know, Wet'suwet'en, their struggle against pipelines, Coastal GasLink and fracked gas and Enbridge and many more pipelines has been you know, very much on the radar for many years. And I've organized alongside the Wet'suwet'en Nation for a decade or more. And, you know, one of the protocols that they have when you enter their territory is they have a free, prior, and informed consent protocol. And I'm paraphrasing here, but you will get asked, right? You will get asked, what is your intention? Do you work for the state, or do you work for any pipeline company? Do you work for the RCMP, et cetera? You know, what are you hoping to achieve? And, you know, what's the reciprocal relationship we're going to create with each other? And, you know, I've often actually been asked, similar to the question that I got baited on, but not as obvious, you know, around the gentrification story that I told. But I've often been asked, like, you know, you have been to Wet'suwet'en territory, you follow the FPIC protocols, and also protocols here on these territories. Is that not like a border guard? And I'm like, absolutely not. Like, these are folks who are asking questions that we should all be asking, right? Like, who are you accountable to? Like, the purpose of creating community is to ask those questions about, like, what are your reciprocal relationships? What is your accountability? How are we in community? And so, you know, accountability in the same way that when we're talking about sexual violence, right? Accountability processes are not carceral. People thinking about how to build community is not the same as being a border guard. And those are distinct things. And we can't lose sight of the fact that the state is a formation that is inherently violent. And when we're talking about the community doing something, it's not like, oh, you're just doing the same thing the state did, ergo bad. Like, no, we're not the state, right? Like, it's not the intention or the method. It's like, the state and carceral violence mean something specific. They're not an analogy for something else. And so for me, it's very similar to when people think that, an accountability process has resulted in someone being asked to step away from an organizing project. Isn't that you acting like the prison? It's like, no, that's not the same as a prison. That's called accountability. That's called, being in relationship. That's being a part of a process. I'm not reacting to you. My face is just is reacting to those kinds of comments, just to be clear. And for me, I think creating community and creating a sense of membership is natural, but that's not the same as being a border guard. And it means also not having, creating community that's fluid and adaptive, right? Like communities have often had expanded ideas of what kinship means, of joining communities, being adopted into communities. All of these things are not static or essentialist. And part of organizing is the process of relearning and reclaiming and rebuilding those kinds of things, right? And yeah, I do think part of the struggle, of course, is that we've all inherited nationalism as a primary way of how we think about group belonging. But if we really broke it down, it doesn't really make sense, right? Like if when shit hits the fan, we're gonna go to our actual community, like the people that we know and trust and our neighbors. And maybe one of those neighbors is actually not a Canadian, right? Like maybe they're actually someone who doesn't have a Canadian citizenship. Maybe they're a migrant worker. Maybe they're undocumented. Maybe they're an immigrant. So it kind of falls apart when we think about the reality of our lives, right? Or who we think our coworkers are. Maybe a bunch of our coworkers are non-Canadians too. And so I think when we ask ourselves those questions in our daily lives about like who we cross paths with, right? Like who pumps our gas, who's our coworker, who's shelving and selling us our groceries, who's growing our food. A lot of them are probably not Canadians and who are contributing to our community and our well-being, even though, them being non-citizens would make us believe that they somehow are not part of our community. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you so much. Lots to think about. I have lots of ideas, but I know there's other questions. So yeah.
Harsha, the Mike Ashfield's follow-up question actually dovetails, I think, with some of the things that you just said. Part of his question is, do you think popular sovereignty can ever justify a people in enforcing a border? Does that maybe intersect some of what you said about who we're accountable to?
I think so. And I guess it starts to become one of those questions, right? Like if people are thinking of border as like, for me, we just cannot lose sight of border in their current political formations. Like I'm talking about, and this way I'm not a philosopher, I'm a political organizer. I'm talking about borders in the current state formation. I don't know about borders 700 years ago and, what purpose they served. But I'm talking about nation states borders in the contemporary era as very much connected to state violence and very much connected to imperialism and racial capitalism. Like that is the borders of our contemporary era. Those are the borders that we have to dismantle. Other people, thinking about ways of enacting sovereignty, especially Indigenous sovereignty, which doesn't look like one thing either, right? Nations have different ideas of what sovereignty looks like. And those are also, contested in many different ways. Very high profile struggles, for example, in the United States of the freedmen, freedmen being enslaved people that were held by Cherokees in the United States, fighting for citizenship rights and fighting for membership in the Cherokee Nation in very public ways, right? So sovereignty is contested in many different ways by many different people.
Thank you. We've got another question from Facebook Live. What would you recommend on an economic level to move us forward globally in a no border world? Any
non-capitalist economies?
Yeah, indeed, non-capitalist economies. And dealing with some of the financial inequities, and even in how we're going to deal with the current fallout of the COVID crisis. There's lots of tools for thinking about how we might kind of move towards that type of a world. Are there any other questions here from the room, from the Zoom room? Seeing none, and recognizing that we're coming fairly close to time. Harsha, I really wanted to thank you very much for what was a really interesting talk. I hope that we get an opportunity to talk more in the future. This was a really interesting talk about some of the contemporary problems of capitalism and viewing them from the border and from the colonial histories that border represents. So thank you very much. I wanted
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone.